Well, on my very first day of divinity school, at my very first morning chapel service in Marquand Chapel, we did something that seemed curious, frankly, even a little gimmicky at the time. I don't know what I arrived at the service expecting. I guess probably a lot of singing, earnest praying. I'm sure the service had plenty of those too. I don't remember that part. I'm sure they were there. Near the end of the service, though, the dean of the chapel came forward and said, "Friends, now we're going to offer you a few minutes to compose a letter to yourself about your hopes and prayers and worries for this coming year, or, if you prefer, for this whole journey of divinity school that is before you." And she continued, "We'll also offer you an envelope. And once you've written your letter, if you wish, you may put your name on the envelope and seal it. And we will keep it in this box and keep the box here in the chapel until the morning of your graduation. And then you may have it back." Well, I'd heard about stuff like this. Truth be told, it did not seem like something that would be my thing. But you know, it's the first day. I understood new experiences are part of the deal, so I did as I was told. I started my letter. And I wrote a lot about my worries, actually. And in writing about my worries, I came to realize that I had quite a few. Was I really cut out to be a pastor? Was going back to school at the ripe old age of 34, that seemed very old, somehow too late? Everyone else seemed so earnest and so kind. So Midwestern. What would happen when they found out that I was from Brooklyn and could talk that way? There were deeper questions, too. First among those was what this new venture would mean for my marriage, my first marriage, which was already quickly crumbling at that time. Unbeknownst to me at that specific moment, that marriage would end just a few weeks later on Columbus Day weekend, my first vacation in that first semester of divinity school. I knew, and of course I didn't know, on the morning that I wrote that letter. The other question, though it wasn't exactly a question, was just the feeling that I had in those days, that somehow I had not heard from God in a while. This wasn't what I had been expecting. In the lead up to my initial decision to go to divinity school, I'd felt God's presence in all kinds of situations and through all kinds of people. Some of you teach high school, and if you've taught high school, then you know you can see a great deal of triumph and tragedy in the course of a normal day. Seeing God in all that is not that hard to do. Frankly, I think you have to work harder not to see God than to see God in that kind of context. Then summer comes, and life is not so intense, and people don't need you with the same kind of urgency, and most of us look forward to that and recharge in those weeks, but I hadn't, and I didn't, at least not that year. Truth be known, waiting for the school year to begin with my new venture, I'd had a long, dry summer, when God did not seem to be in any of the places that I had grown used to seeing him. And I felt betwixt and between. My prayer life wasn't what it had been. My marriage was full of silences, and I felt adrift, not just from God, but somehow from myself. And that was new and not welcome. So excited as I was to be starting divinity school, this all weighed on me heavily in those early days. Well, maybe you know what such seasons in our lives can be like. Many of us have been through seasons that are even harder, seasons when something that had seemed so very clear before suddenly grows murky, even dark. Many of us know what it's like when the answers we've relied upon seem abruptly full of holes, when our hardest-won answers now seem subject to questions we'd never seemed to notice before. The English Bible translator J.B. Phillips once wrote a short devotional book called "Your God is Too Small." And for faithful people, that's how such seasons in our lives can often feel, as if even God, at least as we've understood him, is no longer big enough to make sense within the world as we now understand it to be. And it can be a rude awakening, to put it mildly. And so it's then, I think, that we encounter the real depth of Jesus' question in this morning's scripture when he asks the disciples, "Where is your faith?" Let's remember at the outset that the circumstances are perhaps somewhat more dire than mine were. Not more serious, maybe, but more dire, at least immediately. Being caught in an open boat in the middle of a sudden storm is a particularly vulnerable kind of moment. And this isn't just them being nervous Nellies either. Many of them were fishermen, of course, and not the kind of people who fasten their seatbelts at the first sign of turbulence before the captain has even bothered to turn on the little sign. Luke confirms their worst fears, saying that the boat indeed is taking on water and that they are in danger. So surely the disciples were to be forgiven if they were terrified and suddenly wondering where God was in the middle of this storm. When the boat you're in starts feeling awfully small, it isn't long before the God you worship can start to feel awfully small too. And how baffling it must have been then. How baffling it must have been to see Jesus there in the middle of it all, sleeping peacefully in the stern, not a care in the world. In all the crashing and the banging and the chaos of that moment, amid all the fear that would paralyze anyone who let themselves go there, I can't say for certain if the disciples are calling on Jesus as a way of calling on God, or if they're just calling for all hands on deck because this thing is going down. But whomever it is that they're calling, it's God who answers. It's God who rebukes the storm. And of course, it's God who asks this immensely important question, which is actually the only line of dialogue that Luke records from Jesus himself in this whole story. Jesus asks them simply, "Where is your faith?" It is, to be sure, another kind of rebuke. First, Jesus rebukes the storm, then Jesus rebukes the disciples. There is a distinctly, guys, how could you quality to this moment. And of course, it's not really, guys, how could you wake me up? It's, guys, how could your faith in God's presence and care, how could your faith in my presence and care turn out to be so flimsy. But this leads to the key moment. The key moment. Luke ends his story without further ado by saying, "And they were afraid," the disciples. "And they marveled, saying to one another, 'Who then is this, that he commands the wind and water, and they obey him?'" And that's the key. Who is this? Who then is this? Because it's then that they begin to realize that their God has been too small. It's then that they begin to realize that something very deep inside each one of them is being called to shift. God's world turns out to work in ways that they had not quite understood as well as they had thought. Who then is this? Who then is God? And I guess I would just say that this doesn't strike me as a question of doubt. It's the question of a faith that is changing. Changing and just as clearly growing. It is an unsettling fact that for us, growth so often feels like doubt. It can be bewildering. In some circumstances, terrifying, and in so many, and I'm here to testify to this one, it is just so terribly lonely. But perhaps it's more accurate to say that if faith is more complicated than we sometimes think, well, so is doubt. But clearly, when the truth as we've understood it no longer seems to fit and we begin to doubt it, it isn't that nothing is true. It's that how we are grasped by the power of a new insight, a new recognition of the truth, has not yet taken hold. Who then is this? To be a disciple is to trust that there always is a then, always a new perspective that will come into focus. But we cannot get there until the old answers begin to lose their grip. And so there must be room for doubt. Doubt is one of God's preferred ways of reaching us. I think that was a lesson I learned actually on my last morning of divinity school, when the dean of the chapel processed into our final worship service, and she was carrying this large box full of the letters that my classmates and I had written on that first day, and it was clear from some of the looks on other people's faces that they had not given that letter another thought. What is Siobhan doing with the box? You could see it. So I opened that letter that I had written to God and to me. It was not simply that my grief and worry had turned to joy, though that was also true. It was that I realized how close God had been in those early days. In those days when he had seemed so very absent. It was actually that God was calling me, reluctant though I was, into a new and far more hopeful future. Oh, I had my plan for what I was going to do with that degree. I knew exactly where I would go. I actually had my apartment that I wanted at Kent School picked out. I knew. What I did not know was that actually something much more powerful and beautiful had been set in motion. and that the love of God was way bigger and more wonderful than I could possibly have understood when I started. Who then is this? The disciples asked. It is our doubts that remind us that the answer is always a surprise.